Hi everyone, welcome to week 4 of INF447. Hope you're all well. A few things to get through, sort of housekeeping and things. The first is it's important to note that this Sunday, so the 9th of August, is the census date for this session. So that's the last date that you can withdraw from this subject without any financial penalty. I'm sure some of you are weighing up your options. I know that the situation in Victoria is pretty grim at the moment, and obviously in other places as well. I'm sure lots of you are juggling lots of different balls at the moment. If it would be useful to have a chat with me about sort of workload and requirements and help you make that decision, maybe you want to talk about assessment due dates and things, then do get in touch. I'm very happy to talk to you about any of those issues. So drop me an email and we can have a chat over email, or we can talk over the phone. Just let me know, but definitely keep that date in mind if you are thinking of withdrawing. Obviously, I hope we keep as many of you as possible. There's a really nice subject community growing, but I totally understand the pressures you're all under. Okay, so that's census date. The next thing to mention is the the next online class to discuss the assessment 2. So that thank you to everyone who filled out the doodle poll. It was very close between the Tuesday evening and the Wednesday evening. There ended up being one more vote for the Wednesday evening. So that's the time we'll go for. So that's Wednesday evening this week, Wednesday the 5th of August, that is, at 7:30 p.m. I'll send a link out. It'll be the usual Zoom meeting room, the room that's linked from the online classes or online meeting section of the subject site. And what I will do is I'll talk a little bit at the start of that meeting about the assessment, but mainly leave lots of time for questions. So one thing I would suggest doing before you come along to that meeting is within the resources folder here, there's an additional guidance document for this assessment. And I would definitely recommend having a read through that if you haven't already. Now, this does need to be read in conjunction with the kind of formal assessment guidelines, but it does answer some of the common questions that we have about this assessment. So definitely have a read of that if you can before the meetings. You may find some of your questions are addressed in there, but very happy to talk. I'll basically explain what we're looking for and what we were asking you to do in this assessment. I'll talk a little bit about kind of common issues we find with marking this assessment and give you some suggestions about things to focus on and things to think about, and then very happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay. And of course, that meeting will be recorded. So to those of you who can't make it, I'm sorry. Obviously, we have to try and pick a date. There's no perfect date and time. Bear in mind it will be recorded, and there will be another one of these sessions a little bit closer to the deadline. And depending on, I might do a similar poll for that. And depending on availability, I may run actually 2 sessions. I might run an afternoon one and an evening one, just to try and maximise the chance of you attending these, because I know that they can be quite useful. Okay, so I'll put all the details of that in the email that goes along with this video. The final thing I wanted to mention was the forums. So it looks like there've been some really interesting discussions in those sort of small group forums. A few questions shared in the Module 2 general discussion forum, and I've just given a response to some of those. I think they're really interesting. Now, I've had a look through all of those discussions, and Sue and I will be sort of going through, and if there are any kind of open questions or anything we think it might be useful for us to weigh in on, we'll do that over the next few days. What I did think, though, was how useful some of those discussions might be that are currently in those small group forums for everyone to have a chance to read, because I think there is some really useful resources being shared. There's some really useful questions and answers being posted. Now, I am conscious that this was presented to you as a kind of space for just your small group discussion. but I was thinking it might be quite useful to open these up for anyone to be able to view. So what I'm going to suggest is, if you would prefer your group discussions not to be made public, perhaps you could drop me an email and let me know. And if even just one person from the group doesn't want that, they can just email me, and I'll keep that group hidden and private from everyone else. But if I haven't heard from anyone in the group, then I'll make it open, and I'll do that on Thursday this week, Thursday the 6th of August. So if you drop me an email by noon on Thursday to say I'd rather not have our group discussion made public, then I'll make sure it stays hidden. But otherwise, I'll make sure I'll open them all up on Thursday, because I think genuinely it'd be really useful for you all to have a chance to have a look through some of those discussions in other groups. Okay. So this week, week 4, we're looking at learning module 4, and we're now on to methods. Now, I think in my the first online class, I showed a little graphic which distinguished between paradigm, which is obviously the kind of philosophical assumptions and theoretical assumptions that underpin research. Methodology, which is the kind of overall approach, it obviously often follows on from the paradigm, and we can think broadly in qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods approaches to research. And then we have methods, and then we have techniques. And as noted in this learning module, the term method is often kind of misused. So by method, what we're thinking about here are the kind of formal tools, the kind of suite of tools that that inform the kind of formalized approach to the actual research itself. So when we're thinking, and we need to distinguish those from the kind of data collection techniques. So if we think about some research where we want to understand librarians' perceptions of something, and we want to go in to the library, and we want to talk to librarians and understand what they do and how they do it, and how they view a particular thing. The method there is probably a kind of ethnographic approach. So this describes the kind of method of the research, and the techniques then would be something like the interviews we do or focus groups. So the data collection technique is how we're actually collecting the data. The method is a bit broader than that. It's the kind of framework with how we construct those techniques and fit them together. Now, there are some good examples given. The most common methods given are covered in this learning module. And along with each one, we have an example from the literature that gives us gives an example of how this kind of method has been used. Now, you may notice that this week we have all of these examples are from the teacher librarian, school library context. So what we'll see is, as we move through next few weeks, each week we kind of use a different library context to give the examples from. So there's academic libraries and there's public libraries in future weeks. And this week all the examples are given from the sort of school library context. And the idea of this is it just gives you some exposure. Each week gives you exposure, as well as learning about the kind of content of the module, in this case methods. It also gives you exposure to a particular kind of strand of LIS research and a particular context for research. And obviously, there's no absolute requirement to kind of read all of those articles in detail. It may be that there are some methods you're particularly interested in, and in that case, it might be useful to read an example of that kind of research. But there's a lot of other reading that's required in this subject and in other subjects as well. So I just wanted to kind of clarify, it's not expected that you read in detail all of these examples, but if you're interested in that method, you may want to have a look and go through them. And you'll notice in the learning activity this week, we're asking you to read a chapter of the textbook, and then the textbook has kind of a chapter on most of these methods. So we're asking you to read one of those in detail and share your thoughts on that on the discussion forum. Now, I just wanted to very quickly talk about a few of these methods, and I wanted to talk about the methods that are most commonly kind of misunderstood or as terms are misused. And I'm going to start with case studies because the learning material here specifically notes that this is a misused term. Now, a case study is a very specific and particular type of research. And the way it's misused, as you'll see here, is that people tend to assume that any kind of research that is sort of located within one case, for example, is a case study. And that's not the case. So if we're interested in student use of ebooks, I'm a librarian in an academic library and I'm interested in student use of ebooks, and I think, oh, I'll do some research in my library and I'll talk to some students and look at some usage data maybe, and that'll make it a case study. Well, that alone does not make it a case study, okay? The key thing to a case study is that there has to be a significant consideration given to the case. What we're doing here is we're investigating in detail a particular case. So it might be that is an organization. It might be some other kind of entity, a kind of system, for example. But there has to be some rationale and reasoning and thought given to the selection of that case. And this is an example. This is a paper, and there are lots of resources out there that you can use to read out more about case studies. It's a very commonly used method. But this is a kind of table which gives details of the method you could use to select your cases. So let me give you an example. At the moment, I'm engaged in some research with colleagues here in the school, looking at public library responses to the COVID-19 crisis. And at the moment, we've got a sort of a large-scale survey out that public libraries are responding to, and that's the first phase of that research. The second phase of our research is going to be a multiple case study. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at are 3 or 4 library authorities in Australia, and we're going to do an in-depth study of how they have dealt with the crisis. So I guess this is a key thing to say here. If we had just gone to Wagga Library and said, let's look at how Wagga are doing this, have responded to the crisis, and we gave no thought other than to the fact that most of us are based in Wagga and that's local, that doesn't really make it a case study. What makes it a case study is the process we're going through now, where we're thinking about what's the purpose of this research? Is it exploratory? Is it descriptive? Are we trying to confirm something? And based on that, what are the interesting cases? What are the criteria we're using for selecting the cases? Are we looking for typical library authorities? Are we looking for a diverse range? Are we looking for particularly innovative ones? All of these different approaches will fit with a different sort of intention or aim for the research. And that's really a key part of the case study process. But the selection of the case is linked to what we're trying to do, and this is all part of the method of case study research. And another key thing to mention about case study research is that usually it's expected that a case study will use multiple forms of data collection. So going into one library and just doing some interviews doesn't really make it a case study, because we're not fully understanding the case. What we want to do in a case study is we want to interview, we want to do a survey, we want to look at usage data. And that's actually what we're planning to do in our research. We're going to be talking to library staff, we're going to be doing a survey of library users, we're going to be doing an analysis of library usage data. Now, as well as having these, discussing the different criteria of why we're selecting different cases and what we're trying to get out of this, there are also practical considerations. I mean, most importantly, which libraries will agree to participate in this, because we're asking quite a lot of them. We need access to their data, and we need them to help us distribute a user survey and so on. So that's not to say that things like convenience and access aren't factors in selecting a case, but the key thing is they're not the only factors. This is really driven from a methods perspective, and our approach is that we'll probably identify a kind of short list and then approach those to see which libraries are willing to work with us. So that's case study research. So the next method I wanted to talk a little bit about is action research. And I know many of you work in educational contexts, and you may well be familiar with action research because it really has grown out of educational research and approaches to research in the classroom and in schools particularly. I guess I'll leave you to read about this. It's described in brief in the learning module. There's a nice chapter in the textbook about it. I guess there's a couple of things to mention. The first is that there are different forms of action research depending on the different kind of theories that underpin it. Critical action research is a well-known kind of flavor of action research, if you like. And I think the key thing, the reason I wanted to mention action research, and I guess this is similar to the point I'm making about case study research, is that it's kind of easy potentially to make the mistake of assuming that any kind of research that involves some kind of action is action research. And again, I guess the theme I'm trying to make here is that some of these methods, like case study research, like action research, have quite important and fundamental kind of elements to them. And they're not really things you can just sort of pick little bits out of and make, and it's still action research. So in the sense of action research, it has this very specific kind of iterative nature to it. So this idea of planning some action, implementing it, evaluating it, reflecting on it, revising that action, and then evaluating that, and so on. So we have this cycle or spiral that kind of illustrates this. So just making some change to your organization and then evaluating it isn't necessarily action research. Action research has these kind of key steps to it that you would expect to see. That kind of research would be more sort of evaluative research. So there is a kind of, I know I've had discussions with students in the past about the distinction between the kind of practices that a lot of organizations will do, implement something and evaluate it, as opposed to how is that different to action research. And I would stress that it's this idea of it being iterative and ongoing and kind of formalized with particular approach to the researcher being a participant in the research. So it's often called participatory action research. The idea being that the researcher is part of this process. They're part of implementing, they're within a school context, they're working with the students to evaluate and design and reevaluate and re-implement action and concrete differences in the classroom or whatever organization it is. And the last thing I wanted to mention just briefly was survey research. Now, the word survey is another term that is often misused in the literature, and often we encounter the word survey used sort of synonymously with questionnaire. And I would just it's so widespread that perhaps it's the kind of the stable door as the horse is already bolted, if you see what I mean. But I think it's useful to understand the distinction between survey as a method and questionnaire as a kind of data collection technique. And to do that, I'm just going to illustrate it using the SAGE Research Methods map. Now, there was a link to SAGE Research Methods in the first learning module. I don't know how many of you have discovered it already, but it's a fantastic resource. You do have to be logged in to CSU to access it, and I'll put a link in the announcement email that goes on with this. This is just one aspect of it, this methods map, but it's quite a useful one because it allows you to explore all these different aspects of research, getting more or less granular. So you can come out here to there, I can't remember where that's gone, but anyway, there's so here we have survey research. So it's a useful tool to explore, and there's a search bar up here, and SAGE has an enormous repository of methods related literature, almost all of which you have access to through this CSU account. So if you're looking for something, sort of guidance on a particular term, or you want to read more about a particular method or paradigm or whatever, and you had a look at the textbook and you want more resources, this is a great place to go. And you'll find not just journal articles, you'll find book chapters, videos, podcasts, all sorts of resources in here to have a look at. But looking back at survey research, Sage notes that it has different meanings. But when we're thinking about it in a method, we're thinking about asking some sample of people questions to gather data about their opinions and behavior. Now, one way of doing that could be a kind of online questionnaire, which I think now is typically what we think about by surveys, but it could be a closed phone interview where you're just being asked specific questions. It could be a survey, people stopping people in the street. It could be all sorts of ways of collecting that data. But ultimately, what we're thinking about here is sort of pre-prepared set questions. We're not necessarily asking people, this kind of semi-structured exploring their perceptions of things. We're asking sort of regimented questions on a particular topic to learn more about it. And I think that they're all the methods I wanted to talk about today. But the final thing I'll say, and I guess this might have some relevance to assessment too, and I guess more generally thinking about evaluating research, is that you will sometimes, in fact quite often, read research that tells you a lot about the data collection techniques, but that doesn't necessarily specify a method. Now, in the case of something like, we were trying to research public library user perceptions of our interlibrary loan. So we gave this questionnaire to a bunch of people who came into the library. Now, they don't use the word survey there, but we know from what they're doing that is survey research. The method they're using is a survey. So in those cases, it's quite easy to kind of deduce what the method used was, and we can be quite certain about that. In other types of research, it's not so easy. So sometimes you will read research that just says we did some interviews with this particular group of people. Now, there's interviews as a data collection technique could actually be part of a number of different types of methods. Perhaps it could be part of ethnographic research. It could theoretically be a form of survey research. It could be part of a case study. It could be even part of an experiment, I suppose. So in those cases, it's not necessarily as easy a job as it is with a survey or a questionnaire to sort of pigeonhole it within a particular method. And I think that's in those cases it is a slight flaw in the research that they're leaving that open. Often interview-based research is a kind of form of ethnography, so that's not an assumption you can make, but that might be something that guides your thinking if you're reading research that is using interviews to understand the perceptions of a particular population. It might have something in common with ethnographic research. But it might be the case that you can't be certain of what method was used here, and that might be more or less of a problem, and that might make you think something about the research you're reading. But I guess I think where in the past students have perhaps got into a little bit of trouble is the fact that a method isn't specified. They've then assumed, okay, well, this must be case study research, or I'm going to say that this must be ethnographic research. I guess the point I'm stressing is it's okay to say it's not clear what method, what kind of formal method the researcher is using here. And you'll find when you read when that kind of research, that maybe that has an impact on how we're evaluating it. Because if we're not clear what one of the advantages of these kind of formal methods is, as I've just been saying, there are kind of rigorous elements to them. And that's the advantage of using a method that the previous people have done the hard work of kind of formulating and designing these methods and making them rigorous and giving you a framework for thinking about your data collection. So if research you're reading isn't indicating they've done this, perhaps you need to look a little bit more carefully to check about the kind of assumptions and the rigor that they've brought to the kind of design of their data collection and analysis. So that's all for me today. I've gone on a little bit longer than I planned, but I hope to see many of you on Wednesday evening for the assessment meeting, and if not, I'll speak to you again next week. Bye-bye.